It does not go away. You cannot just sweep it under the rug. It will bubble up and it will show up in personal behavior decisions, it will show up in communication at work, and it will show up in the workplace culture. When financial anxiety goes unnamed, it can shape our personal decisions, our team dynamics, and even our workplace culture. It does not have to be that way, though. When we can learn how to spot financial anxiety, we can create more room for the type of workplace that we want to be in as an individual. I know this because I'm Lindsay Bryan-Podvin, founder of the financial wellness business Mind Money Balance. I'm a licensed social worker, certified financial therapist, and help people at the intersection of money and mental health. By the end of this video, you'll be able to spot how financial anxiety might be influencing you at work, whether you're an employee, a coworker, or a leader, and walk away with a practical question at the end of each section to help you respond a little bit more intentionally. Quick disclaimer before we begin, if you're experiencing a crisis or an urgent financial situation, nothing in this video is meant to minimize how financial stress can feel. This is more helpful for folks who have financial breathing room but still experience anxiety or distress around how they show up at work. Let's get into it. Let's start out with how financial anxiety might be impacting you as an individual, so as a team member or as an employee. This might look like overworking or overextending yourself, having a hard time advocating for yourself, being on edge about your job security, or having poor boundaries because of this financial anxiety. If you need some examples, this might look like saying yes to extra shifts even when you're exhausted, not taking PTO even when you're sick, staying in a job with stagnant pay or with responsibilities that are way below your energetic capacity and skill set because the idea of changing feels really risky, or having a hard time accepting supervisor feedback because you're worried it's going to mean that you're going to lose your job. These are just some examples of the way financial anxiety can show up as individuals. But the hard thing about the way that it shows up at work is you might be getting some positive reinforcement for these behaviors. Your boss might be saying to you that they really appreciate you grinding and, responding to Slack messages or emails outside of work hours. Your coworkers might give you that pat on the back at your additional effort or dedication to the job. And it's really hard then to separate out this overworking and financial anxiety from something that may actually be harming you. So if we take a moment to reflect on the why behind those types of behaviors, you might figure out that some of these things are more from financial anxiety and less because you just want to do a really good job at work. We could learn that this financial anxiety at work is really coming from feeling financially insecure or feeling like you need to save more money. It could also be some carryover shame from a previous workplace mistake or money mistake. What I think is important to remember as a person who's literally written the book on financial anxiety is that when things feel uncertain or out of control, our bodies crave control. They crave certainty. And work and money can feel like a certain thing. So if I just do X, then I will feel Y. If I just turn in my report early, if I just respond to my boss outside of work hours, if I just take on additional responsibility, then I will feel in control. I will feel less anxious. But I think it's important to remember that perfectionism is an attempt to control discomfort. And instead of just responding in this way to try and get some sort of semblance of control, I'd invite you to think about what else might be going on and to think about other ways that you might be able to respond to some of these internal thoughts and how those behaviors look. So the question I'd pose to you at the end of this section, what is the cost or, what is the cost benefit of this decision? So for example, if you're offered to work an additional shift, ask yourself, what is the cost of working this additional shift? What would I be missing out on, or what would I be saying no to? So while we often think about work and money as just those black and white dollars in, dollars out equations, you might also find that taking on that additional shift, while yes, it may bring in additional money, the cost might be impacting your quality of sleep because you're stressed out about having to get up early or working a shift you don't normally work. It might be at the expense of having a clean and safe space to land, not having the time to do things like your errands or your chores. It might be at the cost of your relationships. You may have to say no to spending time with friends, family, or loved ones. And thinking about it this way, what is the cost? Not just what is the dollar amount that I will get. Asking yourself about the cost of this decision can help get to what else may be going on. And my hope is that it can help you make a more wise financial decision. You may find that it is worth it to pick up 1 or 2 extra shifts per month, but it isn't worth it to pick up multiple extra shifts per week. As a coworker or as a teammate, financial anxiety might look like you being a little bit more judgmental than you'd like to be. Like why you think a coworker is acting a certain way or assuming certain reasons for people on your team's behaviors. You might experience some resentment or engage in passive-aggressive behavior about overtime dynamics, bonuses, promotions. And the reason for this is that when we don't have information, as humans, we jump to conclusions. When we don't have all of the context, we fill in with our minds what we think might be happening. This might look like believing things or saying they're always picking up extra shifts because they're sucking up, or judging their burnout, saying, I can't believe they volunteered to take on additional work on that project. They are already dropping balls left, right, and center. How could they not see it? And it's tricky because at work, we're not entitled to anybody's information about their personal lives or what's going on. It does help sometimes to have an idea of what's happening behind the scenes, what might be happening in their life that we don't know. But when we're only working on assumptions, resentment and intensity can show up in the workplace. It can look like you as a teammate becoming more guarded, having the workplace culture start to feel a little bit more competitive, bonding with teammates or coworkers over gossip and speculation instead of things like support or focusing on the actual work at hand. And we see this bubble up under the surface of workplace culture. And it isn't something where, the HR rep just hands you this manual and says, hey, here's how we handle workplace culture. It is how you actually show up. It's when there is this eye roll, a side comment, a harmless, did you hear about blah, blah, blah moment with your colleague. And if you find yourself in this space of building narratives and filling in the gaps, it's a reminder that you actually don't know. Okay? We just don't. Unless somebody explicitly tells us what's going on, we are jumping to conclusion. So when it comes to being a colleague or a coworker, the question I want you to think about here is when it comes to potential financial anxiety, instead of jumping to conclusions that this person is just sucking up or thinks they're better than you or whatever the case may be, what are things that you can do to assume the best possible reason for another colleague's behavior instead of assuming that it is something negative in some way, shape, or form? And the question there helps you to not be so judgmental or passive-aggressive in the workplace. Now, if you are a leader, you're a supervisor, you're a boss, you're in HR, financial anxiety might look like saying no to requests that might change the budget, being emotionally tapped out during money conversations or avoiding them altogether. It might be leaning on things like tradition or just what we do here instead of actually hearing what your employees are saying. And this is really tricky because on the outside, it looks like you're sticking to some sort of guidebook or rule book, and it might help you to feel a sense of responsibility or control. And while that may be true, it also might set up a dynamic where a team feels like they can't come to you or where you're unable to intervene when workplace culture is starting to go sideways, and you're only really intervening when things get out of hand. And this happens because so many leaders in the workplace are not equipped to navigate the emotional side of financial conversations. We've inherited so many systems that weren't designed for our current reality. So your HR playbook or your leadership guidebook, even if it was written a couple of years ago, has not really accounted for the rapid transition of the cost of living increase here in the United States. And leadership doesn't actually make you immune to financial anxiety. It just might make it harder to pinpoint. If financial pressure is going unnamed at the leadership level, it might get translated into rigid policy that impacts things like how people do or don't use their PTO. It might impact overtime expectations. It might impact people's psychological safety at work. And financial stress, uncertainty, and responsibility can add this additional pressure that can narrow your financial decision-making and bandwidth across every single level. So if you are noticing yourself feeling really rigid and defaulting to no or what the book says and tightening down on policies instead of actually listening to what your team and employees are saying, here's the question I want you to ask yourself. What problem am I trying to prevent right now? And is the solution that I jump to the right one? This question can give you the opportunity to pause and respond with a decision for your team that is rooted in strategy, that is rooted in compassion or empathy, and instead of jumping to conclusions because of financial anxiety. So that's how financial anxiety can show up as an individual, as a team member, or as somebody in a leadership role. And across the board, we can ask ourselves, is this a strategic decision or an anxiety-based one? Is this decision one that will be something that I can stand on a day from today, a week into the future, a month into the future? Or is this just something that feels better for now because of some sort of financial anxiety? As an employee, financial anxiety can impact how you show up at work, poor boundaries, overwork, and survival-based decisions. As a coworker, it can start to fuel a workplace culture that is maybe sliding towards toxicity, but it can certainly fuel things like assumption, gossiping, and resentment. And as a leader, financial anxiety can show up as rigidity instead of strategy and empathy. When financial anxiety goes unnamed, it does not go away. You cannot just sweep it under the rug. It will bubble up and it will show up in personal behavior decisions, it will show up in communication at work, and it will show up in the workplace culture. It does not have to be that way, though. When we can learn how to spot financial anxiety, we can create more room for the type of workplace that we want to be in as an individual. It can help us if we are in a team role, having a healthier team. And if we're in the leadership role, it can help us have workplaces that actually support our employees' overall well-being. So if you're an HR leader, a manager, or an organization that wants some help addressing financial anxiety in a direct way, because you're seeing some of these things pop up with your employees or with the team culture, let me know. This is literally what I do in my financial workshops, trainings, collaborations, and you can check it out at my website, which I will link in the description box, or if you're listening to this as a podcast, I will put it in my show notes. And if this topic, if hearing about financial anxiety gave you something to think about, by all means, share it with somebody. Something that can be so helpful when we're dealing with any sort of financial, emotional stressor is thinking that we have to do it all by ourselves, but send it to a workplace bestie. Sometimes just sharing something and saying, oh my gosh, I did not know about this. This really resonated with me, can help to plant that seed to start reshaping our relationship with money. Again, whether you're an individual, a teammate, or in charge of workplace culture. Thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next time.